Daniel Waterhouse presents Bulletin Boarders. Alan Terry's address to the graduates of the Academy of Service, class of 2034.
The Academy of Service, located in Warren, Vermont, offers a tuition-free one-year graduate program for exceptional thinkers and leaders who are considering dedicating their lives to public service.
My mind is an ocean blue. From these waters, thoughts form me to you. Observer serves a higher point of view. Now we see that you are me and I am you.
On the evening of May 15th, 2034, spring had finally sprung in the Mad River Valley and in the small town of Warren, Vermont. It had been a long winter, like the good old days, according to the local winter sports enthusiasts. And the melt and the resulting mud didn't arrive until late April. Now, several weeks later, from the depths of frozen death and dormancy, had come an explosion of life. Everything was alive. You could feel it and smell it in the air, especially in the fragrance of freshly cut grass in Vermont on a warm evening, as the rapid growth of the courtyard lawn had necessitated a second mowing that same week to maintain a well-kept environment for the graduation week banquet. Leading up to that night, there was an anticipatory buzz among the students due to rumors that something important was about to happen. The name of the evening's host hadn't been disclosed, but those in the know had assured them that this night would be special. After dinner, all 12 of them, 6 male and 6 female, gathered in the meeting hall around the large racetrack-shaped farm table that had served so many different purposes over the past year, and waited patiently. When Alan Terry entered the room and assumed the speaker's seat at the head of the table, they shared subtle looks of disappointment. As a teacher of the core class on the evolution of U.S. government, and one of the local members of the Board of Trustees, this was somebody who everyone present already knew. As a result, there appeared to be a temporary deflation of their lofty expectations. But gradually, over the next few minutes, the students began to get it, and eyes opened wide in rapt attention. Alan puffed out his chest, and an exaggerated deep voice started his address.
Ladies and gentlemen of the class of 2034. No, in all seriousness, I want to start by saying it's been such a great pleasure getting to know you all. You're everything that we could have hoped for and more from our first graduating class. And you bring me optimism both for the future of this program and for the future of the world in general. So, thank you. As you know, until now I've never shared any of my stories from the beginning of the movement. Obviously, it's not an accident that there's very little biographical information available about Doug Wolf from that time. And similarly, that until now, little has been revealed about the inner workings of the Seven. Tonight's graduation address is part of a larger effort. With the support of the folks here at the Academy of Service, I recently started piecing together the history of the formative years. We all agreed that it seemed like the right time to undertake this important project. Before the memories fade in the minds of the participants, but far enough down the line that we've ensured compliance with Doug Wolf's final wish to, quote-unquote, not let it be about him, which has certainly achieved the intended effect of de-emphasizing his individual contributions. I thought this gathering would be an appropriate forum to share some of these untold stories for the first time, because you've certainly earned the right to know what I know, and to take from it what you see fit to advance your own learning and understanding. So as a result, I humbly offer you the account of my time with Mr. Douglas Wolf and the men and women who are actively involved in choosing those first steps in the beginning.
And so began Alan's story. Now, in order to make this presentation more comprehensive and cohesive, I'm including some background information not covered in Alan's address. For those already familiar with the broader details of this story, thank you for indulging my redundancy. On the morning of Sunday, April 25th, 2027, Leslie Wolf of Morrisville, Vermont, sat down to a cup of tea at her soapstone kitchen peninsula and opened a letter addressed to her by her late husband, Douglas Wolf, which had been written only 3 weeks prior. It read, "My dearest Leslie, I want you to know that I will love you always with all of my heart. Given the direction that my life has taken in these last years, I realize that this was not always crystal clear. For this, I offer my heartfelt apologies. It's not lost on me that you never signed up for any of this, yet throughout the journey you provided unconditional and unwavering support, and for this I will be eternally grateful." The next paragraph detailing the relationship over the years has been omitted due to its personal nature. In a long series of humble requests, here is my last. Please don't let them make this about me. At times like these, others are prone to aggrandize the lives and deeds of the deceased. However, the real story is this. A man, through circumstances unique to his own journey, was introduced to a message. He embraced it as if it were his own, and served it briefly until his time had passed. But he was only a dutiful custodian, and now others will serve it in his stead. Yours eternally, Douglas. Later that same day, Leslie wrote an email to the 7 men and women who were her husband's closest confidants, now commonly referred to as the 7. It read, "Hello, friends. I regret to inform you that Doug passed peacefully yesterday in his sleep. I apologize if you've been trying to reach me by telephone. But when the news story broke, my phone started ringing constantly, and I was forced to shut it off to maintain my composure. It's been a tough day. Please find the attached note that I found from Doug this morning and read it now. My grief was somewhat restrained for the first 24 hours, but this note broke down the floodgates. What I wouldn't give for one last conversation with him to discuss everything that hadn't been discussed in these past few years when he seemed so distant. What was he thinking? What was he feeling? Did he ever miss what we once were? So many unresolved questions. I suspect some of you understand what I'm feeling and have some questions of your own. I included a copy of Doug's note because I wanted you to see it for yourselves as written by him. My preliminary thoughts are that we should have a gathering here in Morrisville. Instead of placing the emphasis on Doug's life, we would make it a celebration of the collective bond that many of us share as a result of his example, and that will live on in his absence. All would be welcome. Please feel free to offer your feedback. Yours in truth, Leslie. 6 days later, on May 1st, 2027, nearly 100,000 people descended upon the small town of Morrisville, Vermont. To put this in perspective, the attendance at the aforementioned celebration was roughly 4 times the entire population of Lamoille County. This is quite a story in itself. However, before we get into that, the obvious question is, who was Doug Wolf, and what made this collective bond that he inspired so important to so many people that they would travel from far and near, some without concrete plans for food or accommodations, just to be present at the memorial service? Well, history books tend to place an emphasis on the initial act that was the catalyst for what came after. In the early morning of Thursday, August 4th, 2022, Doug Wolf tacked an 11 by 17 laminated poster on an empty bulletin board under the clock near the central intersection downtown. It read, "Citizens of Morrisville and Lamoille and Washington counties, I solemnly declare that on this day I am born again. I no longer see value in myself as self, and thus am firmly committed to spending the rest of my days engaged in public service and the pursuit of impeccable intent. As I have spent a considerable part of the last 2 decades studying American government, I thought that this service may be best applied by offering my independent candidacy for the Vermont House of Representatives, Lamoille, Washington District. Douglas Wolf, Stagecoach Road." Later that morning, a local photographer and musician became captivated by Doug's poster. He snapped a photo which he then posted on Instagram and Facebook, and inadvertently jump-started a passionate conversation about the American political landscape at the time. The photo itself was among the most widely shared on U.S. social media that week and became the hottest topic in many internet discussion forums. Some explanations for the unexpectedly high rate of engagement include the sheer number of influential political thinkers and activists who commented on it, the wide variety of meanings derived from it, and its appeal to voters across the political spectrum. Who was Doug Wolf? How would the U.S. political landscape be changed if there came to be a significant number of informed citizens who single-mindedly dedicated their lives to selfless public service via political office? Doug's simple statement seemed to strike a nerve with a considerable number of Americans who'd grown tired of the political status quo. So for the span of a few days, Doug Wolf went from being an unknown candidate from a small town in a small state to one of the USA's most widely discussed news stories. Despite this and the importance of the movement that he inspired, relatively little is known about the man himself. Most historians attribute this to his repeated insistence that, quote-unquote, "it's not about me." His extreme reluctance to speak on public record, and the respect those surrounding him had for his privacy. I'm fairly certain that Alan Terry's address to the first graduating class of the Academy of Service will go down as a significant historical event, as it offered for the first time a glimpse into the minds and deeds of Doug Wolf and his closest collaborators, as conveyed by one of the primary eyewitnesses. Without further ado, let's return to the recording from that memorable address.
Wow. I'm glad you're as excited about all of this as I am. I've been waiting for years to share these experiences. In the process of trying to piece together the history, we've accumulated hundreds of pages of notes and many hours of recorded interviews. What I've found most interesting is the broad range of perspectives that various participants in the early years had of both the events and the trajectory of the movement in general. For tonight's gathering, I've decided to forego making an objective historical presentation, and instead will simply tell you the story as seen through my eyes. Now, the big advantage of this, I hope, is that it will help you to better understand the context of those years from which all of this emerged. To make this a bit more fun, I've been experimenting with voice impressions of some of the central figures of the movement. And of course, I couldn't resist the temptation to throw in my take on a bad Boston accent. In the near future, you'll also be able to learn about the perspectives of others as we edit all of the material that we collected and try to present a more formal historical document. When putting together the notes for this talk, I found myself commenting on certain works and initiatives at length. In order to keep the story flowing, I've summarized these sections in the address, but I've also written up the full deep dive descriptions in an appendix. And written copies of that appendix will be made available over there near the dessert table so that you can learn more about those areas that interest you. Finally, as tonight's presentation is being recorded, I'm going to divide my story up into chapters for ease of future reference. All right, you ready? Let's get into this. Chapter 1. A dire state of affairs. Okay, to kick things off, I'm going to start with a quick story to give you a sense of how my friends and I were feeling at the time of Doug Wolf's historic bulletin board post in August of 2022. In April of that year, my college roommate Jamie Craig, our mutual friend Tommy T, and I hiked from our Harvard dorm near the banks of the Charles, over the bridge, and into nearby Alston for a gathering at Hans Kluber's house. Hans liked to call his place the Island of the Misfit Toys, due to all of the unusual characters that passed through its doors. On that evening, Hans and I were sitting cross-legged on the floor of his candlelit living room, facing each other across a large unrolled chess mat covered in classic Staunton chess pieces. Our second game had started with the classic gunslinger opening of both king's pawns forward 2 squares, followed by Hans playing the king's bishop pawn forward 2 squares, and me accepting the kind offering of his unprotected pawn, which was sacrificed to open some attacking lines on the king's side. And I said with a condescending tone, "I told you the last time we played this, the king's gambit opening is no good." "How can you say it's no good?" "Because it was solved 10 years ago. Solved?
Yeah, someone took a few hundred supercomputers and ran every logical permutation of the starting position, and concluded that white can't possibly win from here against the best chess engines." And Hans smiled in the confident way of a front man for a rockin' band.
"Thanks, man. I'll remember that the next time I play a supercomputer."
All of us were sipping tea, procured from a giant stock pot on the coffee table. And from the opposite side of the room, I heard bits and pieces of loosely connected political rants while I was trying to focus on the board. A neighborhood girl that we all knew named Jasmine was sprawled out on the couch as if she were sunning herself from an invisible ultraviolet light source in the ceiling.
when she said to no one in particular, "Why are all these political discussions always so negative? The left bitching at the right and the right bitching at the left. Let's not lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, our system works." And from the next room over, we heard an incredulous, "What?" in the combative tone that one finds sometimes in arguments between natives of Boston and surrounding areas, followed by the entrance of a tense, squinty-eyed Tommy T into our dimly lit lair. Those were almost the exact words that you would say if you wanted to get Tommy T riled up in those days. And I looked over at him and I held my hands out, palms pushing down to the ground like this, as if to say, "Calm down, T. You're among friends here." And time passed. 1,000, 1,000, before Tommy blew out a big exhale and then said with a forced, even-keeled voice, "Jasmine, can I explain why I disagree with you?" And then the tension was diffused and we got back to our chess game. And then Tommy proceeded with an argument that I'd heard in various forms several times before. Imagine life in the prehistoric days, back when your parents were kids, before personal computers, smartphones, the internet. Because of this technology, the 4 decades since then witnessed a leap in potential productivity rarely seen in recorded human history. The logical result of this would have been a corresponding improvement in the quality of life for most Americans. We'll go ask people who lived in both times whether they feel better off than they did back then. Even the ones with the 401ks. Some of the economic winners. I've been asking older people in the streets if they feel better off than they were, and I have a hard time finding anyone who's willing to say unequivocally yes. Now that's anecdotal information. Let's consider the facts. In those years, U.S. education plummeted in the rankings of years of schooling per kid and tested cognitive abilities. But you knew that. But check this out. Virginia Commonwealth recently published a paper that showed that life expectancy here in the U.S. is 5 years. 5 years less than in other high-income countries, despite healthcare costs that are by far the highest in the world. They call this the U.S. health disadvantage. And you can be sure that the government and corporate influence played a big part in this sad state of affairs. 5 years. That's a screaming statistical signal. Which again, also says something about the quality of day-to-day lives of most Americans. The U.S. national debt went from less than $1 trillion in 1980 to, $30 trillion. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Inflation-adjusted incomes have been stagnant for the middle class. Allen's man, Bernie Sanders, said in his campaign that over the prior 3 decades, the wealth of the top 1% went up by $21 trillion, while the wealth of the bottom 50% decreased. At least the billionaires are living large. And how's this going to change with corporate money and dark money and super smart algorithms employed for the purpose of influence in elections, with access to massive databases of personal information? So, Jasmine, I'm saying that the system not only doesn't work, but has squandered a golden opportunity to turn this game-changing technology into better lives for average Americans. After Tommy spoke, the room was dead silent while he fetched his own cup of tea and sat next to us at the chessboard. And then he added, "Not to mention the disproportionate consumption of the planet's natural resources during that time." In the meantime, our game had temporarily stalled as Hans's all-in kingside attack was predictably stonewalled by the Fisher defense. And he'd spent a few minutes staring at the board in vain, trying to find a way through. And he looked over at Tommy and said, "Right on, dude. I'm with you. All right, I have a question for y'all. What does the present day United States stand for? Like right now. What are we Americans committed to upholding? Say, Japan would have the culture of the Japanese people. But in our melting pot of races and cultures and traditions, we don't have a similarly easy answer, do we?" Someone immediately yelled out, "Democracy!" And I responded, "What, by democracy you mean an electoral system that offers us the power to choose between two carefully vetted options who are united in their commitment to upholding the status quo?" And Hans found this amusing. Good one, Alt. He compressed Alt to Alt to reflect my contrarian tendencies, and that's the nickname that stuck among this crowd. Anyway, Hans continued. "What if in place of democracy we put government of the electoral process? But isn't the Putin regime also of the electoral process? Certainly not something that I'm committed to upholding. So instead, let's change this to opposition to totalitarian government or unchecked power. Unchecked power always ends up in the wrong hands. Then maybe that describes something that we're all committed to? Alright, hold that thought. Once upon a time, we stood firmly for upholding the rights and liberties guaranteed by the Constitution, right? Which are sort of the foundation for all of Western democracy. If you ask Tommy's man on the street to defend the superiority of what Miss Jazz called the system versus China or Russia or religious states, the most common response you're going to get is freedom, which is closely aligned with upholding the rights and liberties guaranteed by the Constitution. Yet, after 20 years of steady erosion, that argument has no legs anymore. Take the recent assault on the First Amendment. Journalists, scientists, academics, blacklisted because they disagree with the mandated public opinion? Fired, censored, assets frozen? Is there anything more important to democracy than freedom of speech? It's dead and buried at this point. So who's to be the supreme censor and overseer of accepted discourse in this new totalitarian democracy? Big tech? Does anybody trust big tech? The executive? George W? Donald Trump? Joe Biden? Scary, don't you think? In the first hour of daylight, my friends and I trudged back to Cambridge, a faint glistening lingering at the edges of my peripheral vision. And I said, "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what Hans said earlier. He's right. There's nothing that I can identify as the galvanizing principle that we Americans can point to as our collective bond, or are committed to uphold. We don't really stand for anything anymore, collectively speaking at least. So, if there's to be an effective way forward, that's going to require a whole new national agreement. The only problem is we can't talk to each other anymore. Never mind build a whole new shared foundation of understanding that everyone can get on board with. Does that make us a rudderless society? That is a scary thought. Chapter 2: The Early Years. Since we'll be hearing tonight's address from my unique perspective, it's probably worth learning a bit about the origin of this cynical lens through which I was observing the world at the time. For me personally, the story starts in the beginning of 2016, the second half of my freshman year in high school. I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, as an only child, and both of my parents were teachers in the public schools. I had a very structured life growing up, and my dad certainly played a significant role in determining the places where I spent my leisure time. For instance, my Arizona high school doubles championship was partially the product of active encouragement to play tennis from the time that I was big enough to hold a racket. I also started playing chess at a young age and spent countless hours over the board with my dad until I surpassed him somewhere around the age of 12 and emerged as one of the best junior players in the region. The catalyst for the first signs of independent thinking was a Miss Allison Chen from Madison, Wisconsin. Allison's dad was a visiting professor at nearby Arizona State in early 2016, and she and her mom decided to visit for a couple months and get out of the cold Wisconsin winter. Allison was a frequent visitor at our local chess center during that period, and outside of chess, where I was the slightly better player, ours was almost a teacher-student relationship. She turned me on to a bunch of cool sci-fi books and some great music, and encouraged a budding interest in poetry. In fact, I still have the copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass that she bought me for my birthday that year. Allison was also passionate about national politics, and she allowed me to accompany her to Bernie Sanders' campaign speech in Phoenix prior to the 2016 Arizona Democratic primary. It was that day, among a huge crowd of roughly 7,000, that I experienced an awakening of sorts. As a middle-class kid who always felt like an outsider around the country club scene where I frequently found myself for tennis events, Bernie's vision of a government that represented everyone and not just a privileged minority and a fairer distribution of income really resonated with me. Allison returned to Wisconsin 2 weeks later, and I never saw her again. But the spark of engagement had been ignited. I closely followed the 2016 presidential race after the Phoenix event, and I was crushed when the release of the Guccifer 2.0 hacks in the weeks leading up to the Democratic convention provided evidence that the DNC was biased against the Sanders campaign. While the source and the intent of these hacks would later become a subject of great debate, at the time, the message most Sanders supporters were taking from this was that the presidential nomination process was neither fair nor transparent. My first experience with electoral politics ended in major disappointment. Later that year, rebel rocker Bobby Lynn from one of Allison's favorite bands, Landmine Tripper, released a record whose cover centered around the title, "Blow It All Up." And various phrases were written diagonally around the periphery, including net worth, one man, greater than GDP of nations, end intergenerationally perpetuated inequality, dollars out of politics, we are 99%. I bought the poster version of the record cover, and I hung it on a prominent wall in my bedroom. And I also bought a retro jean jacket and sewed a blow it all up patch on the chest. I must have played the single from that record, RSVP No, 1,000 times over the next year. And while I continued on as usual, I felt a new personal identity based on Bobby Lynn's catchphrase and my new commitment to the idea of economic fairness. But this wasn't a popular subject of discussion at Scottsdale Prep, and I found myself on the fringes of the social scene. In lieu of a social life, I spent almost all of my after-school time for a couple years studying and participating in organized activities, especially chess and tennis. This was another case where my parents strongly influenced my behavior, and that they were both avid readers, and it was natural for us to spend our evenings together silently engrossed in books. This, in part, led to my becoming class valedictorian. When I received my acceptance letter to Harvard in the spring of 2019, I'd had enough of my structured existence, and I was beginning to openly rebel against anything that had been part of my high school life. By the time I arrived in Cambridge, I'd quit chess altogether. And while I started playing again casually a couple years later, I never returned to being the hyper-competitive chess fanatic who was known to sweat profusely during tournament games. And at the end of the fall season, I also quit playing tennis. But at Harvard, I finally found my people, including my assigned freshman year roommate. Jamie Craig was from the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., and his dad Marlon worked in various capacities in the music industry before Jamie's birth prompted him to pursue a more stable and lucrative career in real estate development. Like mine, Jamie's dad also nurtured what would become their strongest bond from a young age. And Jamie was interested in music from the time that he could walk, started playing piano at age 4, and at 8 got his first drum kit. The rest is history, I guess. Marlon was also a good musician, and he and Jamie played together regularly in their basement, which they'd converted to a home music studio and practice space. Jamie showed up to school on day 1 with an audiophile stereo from the 80s and crates of records. Back in Arizona, I was just listening to the same music that everybody else my age was listening to, and honestly, very little of it stood up to the test of time. While I'd stumbled onto some decent underground and alternative bands via suggestions from Allison, like Landmine Tripper, for instance, I hadn't had anyone to introduce me to new and interesting music for years. So Jamie's collection opened up a whole new world to me. Of course, I personally gravitated towards the rebel music, most of which was made before we were born, like The Clash, Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, Bad Brains and the formative bands from the DC punk scene, and Public Enemy, which was my personal favorite, like the sound of a revolution. Jamie and I lived together in Canada Hall, a series of relatively modern brick and cement structures on the edge of Harvard Yard. And our common room quickly became a popular place for fringe characters to hang out on weekend nights, with incense burning and an eclectic mix of records playing in the background. Eventually, our musician friends started bringing over instruments to jam, with Jamie playing a small hand drum that could make a variety of sounds depending on where you struck it. And after he returned from Thanksgiving break with a simple 3-piece drum kit, we were basically a full-on band room on the weekends. Tommy T would often bring over his laptop to record the proceedings or to make beats. And those who weren't especially musically inclined would hammer on percussion tools or freestyle rap or sing, usually very badly. But those are fun times. In school, I chose to major in government, and I became involved with the widely respected publication, the Harvard Political Review, or HPR, and started the orientation process with the goal of eventually becoming a member of the editorial staff. During my freshman year, I had 2 pieces published in the HPR, and the one that was well researched and that I remain proud of was on the immediate need for a simplified and more transparent U.S. federal tax code to ensure that everyone paid their fair share of taxes. Although that piece was my last contribution to the HPR, it ended up playing a significant role in determining my future path, as you'll see soon. The week after the tax piece was finished, we were given 1 week's notice by Harvard to evacuate the premises due to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. Man, that was a surreal experience. In later years, I heard personal stories from the class of 2020 of hasty and unexpected goodbyes, some of which would be forever as graduates scattered to all corners of the globe. And to make matters worse, all of my remaining confidence in electoral politics was eradicated in what seemed like the blink of an eye. On February 8th, 2020, after the Democratic primaries in New Hampshire and Nevada and the Iowa caucus, Bernie Sanders had a solid lead with nearly double the amount of delegates of his closest competitors. Within 6 weeks, amidst the COVID confusion and the mass exodus from college campuses and schools everywhere, the Democratic presidential race was over. Just like that. It came and went like a Mike Tyson first-round knockout, and with the same kind of finality. That year, there was an unusually large pool of potential Democratic nominees, and some of them offered forward-thinking visions of how to go about improving things. In the debates and discussions prior to Iowa, all sorts of new ideas were circulated, including several innovative takes on single-payer health care, a wealth tax, universal basic income. But when Bernie Sanders basically conceded the race to centrist candidate Joe Biden on April 8th, it ended all of those debates instantly. Meaningful change was no longer a topic for discussion, but rather beating Donald Trump and safely restoring the status quo became the Democratic Party's solitary focus. To say that I felt betrayed would be a massive understatement. I was cautiously optimistic that 2020 would be the year of payback for Bernie and those whose interests had consistently been ignored by Washington. Yet somehow, in 6 short weeks, everything reversed course, and the progressive discussion seemed to lose all of its forward progress instantly. Kind of like a player who lands on one of those game-changing slides in the board game Chutes and Ladders. But this time, I wasn't willing to throw the dice again and begin a new ascent of naive optimism. I was done with electoral politics. Or so I thought at the time. There's not much to say about the next year, except that I was a good proxy for America in general. We were collectively hurting in many ways, and all across the country were others like me who had too much time on their hands and wandering minds running amok on the internet, as we all suffered from little direct personal contact. To their credit, my parents tried to be compassionate and supportive during this difficult time, but there was little that they could do. I didn't want to talk to them. I definitely didn't want to revert back to a time when they were my biggest influences. Honestly, my languishing must have been as hard on them as it was on me. Finally, things began to open back up as we approached the summer of 2021. And in the fall, we all returned to Harvard and tried our best to get back to something close to normal. Jamie Craig was a sight for sore eyes, and I gave him a giant hug when I saw him. Jamie was one of the few who'd weathered the intervening days well. He was in top physical shape and had maintained his pleasant, even-keeled demeanor. Jamie'd ridden out the pandemic at Hans's house in Alston, where they'd honed their musical chops together and formed a band with one of Hans's colleagues from the Berklee School of Music. When we returned to school, those guys were putting the finishing touches on their debut EP, which immediately got a lot of airtime on local college radio. The band logo was a parrot, and the name of the band was spelled like Ross the Parrot, but with the circumflex over the O, so it was pronounced like the name of the 1990s third-party presidential candidate, Ross Perot. And while the Berklee guys were amazing musicians, they were also kind of goofy. And part of the shtick was that during extended pauses, the audience would sometimes shout out words or phrases. And when Hans heard something that he thought was clever or compelling, he'd squawk like a parrot and then repeat the word or phrase in his interpretation of the Ross Perot voice, if you could picture that. It was a heavy time for everyone, and RTP, as we called the band, had an excellent remedy for that in the form of infectious grooves and catchy hooks with the aforementioned silliness component and maybe a hint of jazziness thrown in so that they could express their Berkleyness. When the live music scene opened back up during spring semester, the RTP shows were extremely popular among the college crowd. Within a few months of being back in Cambridge, everything was going reasonably well for me at school, especially in comparison to sophomore year. But in the spring, I was forced to face a difficult reality with the summer visible on the horizon. By then, most of my friends and neighbors had a clear vision regarding their futures, and in some cases had already secured job offers pending graduation. Me, I had no clue. I wasn't especially inspired academically, and my life didn't have a lot of direction outside of doing what was necessary to get by. I sent out a wave of relatively late inquiries regarding summer internships with no success, and slowly I started receding back into the funk that had consumed me for most of my sophomore year. In the trough of my depression, Jamie convinced me to drive with him back to Maryland to visit his folks for some good music and home cooking. By then, I'd become friendly with his dad because he'd come up to visit several times freshman year, and he'd treated us to some memorable dinners and concerts. Upon arrival in Maryland, Marlon noticed that I was a bit off kilter, and he asked me about my subdued mood. And I told him about my lack of career visibility and summer employment prospects. And he pondered this for a while. And after dinner, he asked me if I remembered the night when we went to a Thievery Corporation show together, and my extended rant on the car ride home about the lack of quote-unquote real journalism in the world. I answered that I did, and he told me about a recent meeting with one of his real estate clients, a media tycoon who rose up through the ranks from owner-operator of a small-town newspaper to eventually becoming the chairman of a national network of local television stations and newspapers. And this client had gone on a similar rant about how he was disappointed by the lack of real journalism in the media environment of the time. And as a result, he'd endowed a college summer internship program for a handful of the most promising young reporters to work at local newspapers around the country and learn the business from the ground up like he had. One of the internships was at the Stowe Reporter, only 25 miles or so northeast of us here in Warren. And Marlon suggested that I apply to the program and indicate specifically my preference for that one location. Because if I got the job, I could then spend the summer with Jamie and the band at the family vacation house in Stowe. And he gave me a sly smile and said, "Tough to beat the summer in Vermont. Hippie chicks, music festivals, sounds good to me." In the end, Marlon convinced me to apply and submit the tax code editorial as a writing sample, despite my feeling that it was a hopeless endeavor. After all, it had been nearly 2 years since my last activity at the HPR. But a couple of weeks later, I was called to Manhattan for an interview and awarded the position. You know, I sometimes reflect on the irony that the exact type of nepotism that I was railing against back then was a direct catalyst for the events that would put me on my life track. Chapter 3: Arrival in Vermont. So, that summer, I reported to the reporter, and on arrival, the staff was very welcoming. On that first evening, they invited me to join them and their friends for drinks at Zen Barn in nearby Waterbury. Elijah the Beard was our resident beer nerd, and he enthusiastically took the lead in recommending a couple of his favorite IPAs. And in a serious tone, he told me there were more first-rate breweries within a 30-mile radius of Waterbury than in any other place in the world. And I'd find through experience that this was not as outrageous a claim as it had originally seemed. I found it almost impossible to keep track of all of the meritorious beers that were being cranked out by the 25 or so local breweries that were on our radar after a month. And I also learned the hard way from that first night. When drinking double and triple IPAs, one should be proactively cognizant of the alcohol content therein. Our colleague Summer was a yoga enthusiast who often attended classes in the studio above the bar. And it was her idea that we come to Zen Barn because there was a cover band playing that night that specialized in the music of the Grateful Dead. Despite it being a Wednesday, the place was jam-packed with original Deadheads and those who grew up listening to the music with their parents. And as Summer twirled around the dance floor with 15 or 20 others, one of our party joked, "That's the summer of love, man." Some of us hung out on the back deck and smoked. And the relaxed atmosphere and beautiful, cloudless country evening made for a memorable introduction to Vermont. When the alcohol kicked in, the conversation increased in intensity as we talked about the potential importance of the almost extinct practice of objective journalism in a world that seemed broken in so many ways. Later, I staggered into Jamie's house and barely roused myself the next morning from my first full day at work, which I guess was a foreshadowing of what was to come. My trajectory at the Reporter was similar to my experience with national politics. I showed up ready to change the world by exposing injustice, but instead ended up writing about traffic delays due to road construction and a lacrosse jamboree weekend with an invading horde of teens and parents from all over New England and New York. At first, the staff was amused by my grumblings about how I'd come to do real journalism and instead was receiving these mundane assignments. But eventually the complaining got old and the general attitude towards us was, "What did you expect to be writing about at a local newspaper, dummy?" After a couple weeks of this, I came back from the weekend having written an unsolicited and opinionated piece on the evolution of the 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders. The editor called me into his office to ask me what I expected him to do with this, and I left his office extremely frustrated and later vented to my friends about the lack of interest in real journalism that I was finding at the Reporter. Although in retrospect, I'm not sure that my political ramblings qualified as real journalism either. After that interaction, my interest in the job deteriorated quickly. I started leaving early to make up for coming in late, and since the paper wasn't responsible for paying my salary directly, nobody complained. I suspect they may have preferred it that way because my presence in the newsroom was probably seen as a distraction anyway. My focus switched from earning my first Pulitzer Prize for small town newspaper interns, I guess, to enjoying the summer in Vermont. I played tennis regularly for the first time in years, hiked often in the Green and Worcester Mountains. Jamie and I explored local swimming holes, drank a lot of beer, stargazed around bonfires, and of course, I saw a ton of good music, including every RTP show. Most importantly, I powered down my cell phone when I didn't have a specific use for it, and I avoided the internet altogether when I wasn't at work. And this undoubtedly contributed to the carefree vibe, and despite my shortcomings at work, I remember those days fondly as some of the best of my life. On Sunday evening, August 7th, 2022, I was on the way back from a music festival in upstate New York, and I powered on my cell phone to find a bunch of missed calls from Jamie's dad. When I phoned him back, without so much as a hello, he asked immediately, "What do you think about this Doug Wolf business?" With an excitement that I'd never heard from him before. "Who's Doug Wolf?" I responded. "You're kidding, right?" "No, I have no idea what you're talking about." And then I could hear the disappointment in Marlon's voice. "Well, if at some point you want to talk about this, you know where to reach me." And he hung up somewhat abruptly. Since Marlon had never used that tone with me before, I was a bit shaken by this, and suffice to say I hurried home and immediately turned on my computer. Over the weekend, Doug Wolf's bulletin board post and all of its potential implications had become a hot topic among many of the politically aware. I got very little sleep that night as I became deeply immersed in the online discussion. The one thread that occupied most of my time started after the initial wave of curiosity had received so much attention, and a naysayer posted, "A selfless politician in Washington is a wonderful concept, but one suited for pie-in-the-sky idealists. The chances of such a person being elected are close to zero, so acting in support of such a candidate, or even indulging this discussion, is counterproductive, an indication that you're not one to be taken seriously." When this quote found its way to social media, it received a fair share of positive feedback. I'd say this was the sentiment of a lot of people when hearing about Doug Wolf for the first time, especially when applying this selfless ideal to the context of macro politics. The resulting comment on that elicited a lot of responses was, "This commonly held opinion is an excellent starting point for sizing up the present political landscape. It holds that the primary qualifier for identifying a candidate to support is not desirability, but rather electability. And similarly, that ideas should be filtered by what's politically expedient, rather than what's most admirable and beneficial. This method of analysis, that's consistently resulting in suboptimal choices by the electorate, invites a top-to-bottom re-examination of the electoral process." Among the many resulting suggestions for potential fixes, the most popular was the movement to ranked choice voting, where one could order their preferences for multiple candidates, from traditional plurality voting, or one vote for one candidate and that's it. After a couple decades of slow progress, there had been a recent surge in support for ranked choice voting, and new adoptees in the prior election had included the state of Maine, New York City, and a few Democratic presidential primaries. And retrospectively, the ranked choice proponents were proven right in that enabling more complex and descriptive voter preferences at all levels of government in the United States has been among the most transformative changes of the last decade. And we'll see as the story goes along that the early discussion surrounding the movement was similarly enabled by a system of feedback which was far more expressive and collaborative than a simple binary one-time vote. The particular argument in this thread that caught my attention was that the typical American voter had become so hypersensitive to the spoiler effect and the potential of wasting one's one and only vote on an unlikely candidate that it was effectively marginalizing innovative ideas and the voices of candidates advocating them. I found it interesting that in the 33 U.S. Senate races in 2020, no candidate from outside the two main parties received more than 6% of the popular vote, thus clearly demonstrating voter reluctance to waste their votes on candidates outside of the mainstream. Early that next morning, I aired up the tires on the vintage 10-speed racing bike that Marlon kept at the Stowe house, and then zipped down Route 100 to downtown Morrisville to see Doug Wolf's bulletin board post for myself. Strangely, I'd done very little thinking about the underlying issue itself at that point, that there was an actual guy in Morrisville who was announcing his candidacy in this highly unusual way. And there, in the empty early morning downtown, I stared at Doug's poster and was overcome by an intuitive feeling that this simple statement was profound and important. I found myself pacing around aimlessly, completely oblivious to my surroundings. I forgot to lock Marlon's bike and I left it unattended as I walked up and down the block, mine racing at maximum RPMs. Eventually, all roads led back to the question that some derived from Doug's statement. How would the world be changed if there were a well-informed, selfless political class that governed the United States? I could hardly contain my enthusiasm. I raised my arms and let out a yell that cleansed some of the negative thoughts that I'd been feeling for years, and went and retrieved the bike. And then I sped back to the reporter and practically stormed into the editor's office, demanding that I be allowed to interview Doug Wolf. Immediately, I had the vague sense that there was some sort of joke that I wasn't in on. I heard snickering from the main newsroom, and the editor himself even betrayed the hint of a smile. "So, you want to interview Doug Wolf for the Stowe Reporter?" "Yes." "Okay, sure, go ahead." This answer definitely surprised me, as I'd prepared myself for a heated debate. But I paid it little mind and hustled out the door to the neighborhood coffee spot, where I spent a few hours trying to identify some of the issues that might be addressed in the upcoming Vermont legislative session. After I'd assembled a list that I hoped would provide the basis for an interesting interview, I was off to the publicly listed address from Mr. Douglas Wolf on Stagecoach Road, just across the Morrisville town line and only a few miles away from the newsroom. What I hadn't read while following the Doug Wolf discussion was that there was a secondary story surrounding him. He wouldn't speak to anyone. His wife had turned down requests from hundreds of local, national, and international media outlets, including one from my colleague Summer at the Reporter, who'd already made an unsuccessful attempt at reaching Doug. But oblivious to this backstory, I confidently walked my bike up the driveway 100 yards or so to Doug's front door and rang the bell. After a fairly long time had passed, and while I was trying to figure out what to do next, Doug answered the door. I couldn't believe my eyes. Whoa! You're the guy who jammed with RTP a couple months ago at Moog's place. Wow! I can't believe this. Man, that was some of the most inspired playing that any of us had ever seen. We all wanted to meet you, but you were gone before anyone noticed. Thanks, that was a really great night of music. Besides a slight raising of the eyebrows, there was no other acknowledgement that I'd spoken. He stood squarely facing me with an erect posture, yet completely relaxed. He was 4 or 5 inches taller than me, so I was looking up to him literally, and I was intimidated despite his lack of a reaction. So it turns out that Doug Wolf was a phenomenal sax player and a bit of a local legend. For several years, he showed up periodically at the small bar in downtown Morrisville and sat in with whoever was playing that night. And then one day, he just stopped coming. At this particular RTP show, one of our local music friends turned to me with an excited look and whispered out of the side of his mouth, "The sax guy's here." Doug had walked in, sat down at a table, and started prepping his sax to play. It had been years since anyone had seen him. There was a buzz of anticipation in the room as Doug approached the band and asked if they would be open to him sitting in. Hans looked skeptical at first, but before he could answer, he heard the cheers and saw the excitement on the faces of some of our friends and said simply, "Go for it, dude," without knowing what he was getting himself into. The amateur sound man scrambled to connect Doug's mic and set the level on the board, and a deafening squeak of feedback made everyone grimace in pain before Doug's channel was dialed back and normalized. In the beginning, he was barely noticeable as he got comfortable with the band and his volume, but within a couple of songs, he was an equal contributor, tastefully and almost seamlessly integrated into the music. And then finally, they gave him space to solo, and then all other activity in the room stopped as we were mesmerized by what was coming out of Doug's horn. Jamie looked at his bandmates and then me with his huge grin that suggested, "Can you believe what's going on over there?" From then on, Hans had the good sense to minimize the vocals and extend the instrumental sections on all the songs, while holding it down on rhythm guitar, and Doug rose to the invitation with a masterful performance. After an hour or so of that, everyone in the place was spent, and the band went on set break. And then as quickly and mysteriously as he'd arrived, Doug vanished unnoticed without speaking to anyone. Anyway, after an awkward amount of time had passed in silence, with me standing at the front door, he asked, "How may I be of assistance?" And totally frazzled, I blurted out, "Well, my name's Alan Terry, and I study government at Harvard and recently won the Clark Prize for Journalism, and I'm writing for the Stowe Reporter this summer," standing unnaturally erect and puffing out my chest and maybe jutting out my jaw like this to create an underbite. Do you know those giant foam "we're number one" fingers that you see at sporting events? Well, that's the mental image I get when I think of how I extended my hand to Doug. And slowly and maybe reluctantly, he met my handshake, but with the slightest furling of the brow like this to suggest how ridiculous I sounded. And instantly, my phony posturing was completely deflated. But in a moment of surprising self-awareness, I gathered myself and looked into his eyes and said, "I was very moved by the flyer that you posted in downtown Morrisville, and if you're willing, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your candidacy for the state legislature." He thought about it for a moment, and then answered simply, "Please come in," and led me to the addition in the back, a classical library reading room with a higher ceiling than the rest of the house, and a long wall of floor-to-ceiling bookcases with a rolling ladder attached to a track to access the highest shelves. Tucked behind the door in the opposite corner was a cozy reading area with the kind of maroon leather chairs with nailhead trim that one might find in a university. And off the long wall opposite the bookshelves and adjacent to the reading area was a simple but tasteful oval table which was partially covered by small stacks of books, most of which contained multiple post-it bookmarks. A similar writing table, but thinner and squared at the ends, was in front of most of the back wall, and next to a desk with a PC and 4 computer monitors mounted on a pair of metal poles and stacked vertically. All of the wooden furniture was made from the same maple and by the same craftsman from southern Vermont. We sat down across the table, and he thoughtfully moved and restacked some of the books between us and asked, "What is it that you're curious to know?" I fiddled through my papers and removed the sheet listing all the issues that I'd compiled at the coffee shop. Since I strongly supported Doug already and wanted him to do well in the interview, I handed him the list and offered him the opportunity to comment on any of it in any way that he saw fit. He reviewed it briefly and then pushed the sheet of paper back across the table to me and said simply, "I'm not interested in discussing the issues." Now, of course, I was confused and maybe even shocked by this. And I'm sure that I made a confused and shocked face and probably raised my voice a bit like, "How can you run for public office without discussing the issues? Isn't that the very definition of a political campaign in a sense? You announce your candidacy, state your views, and in some cases formally debate these views with other candidates, and then the voter chooses who to vote for based on their personal preferences? Isn't this the way it works, no?" Again, he continued to sit perfectly still, carefully considering how to best communicate his viewpoint in a way that I would understand, and then responded, "I'm afraid that you're missing the point. Why are you here again?" "Well, like I said before, I was captivated by your poster on the bulletin board downtown." "Ah, yes. That statement is the heart of the matter here, don't you think? That is why I've offered my service, not because of a stance on any particular issue." I let this sink in for a minute and then asked, "Okay, say I agree with you and believe that selflessness, scholarship, and a commitment to public service are the most important qualities for an elected official. How do I come to the conclusion that you are the public servant that I'm looking for? You've refused to answer any of my questions regarding issues. Do I have to take you on your word that you know what you're talking about? This seems like an unreasonable leap of faith, doesn't it?" "You raise a valid concern. I'll reflect on this and prepare something for your review. Okay?" And I nodded in assent. I was surprisingly content with this answer. I guess it was probably the tone and the way he communicated it. Like, "I appreciate your perspective and will do my best to help you understand mine." And by simply adding, "okay," it became an agreement between us, as opposed to some kind of standoffish declaration. He sat patiently, nodding slightly with a hint of tension in his face, like he was carefully measuring my response. And the result of this whole interaction was that it felt like we came to an understanding of sorts. And then Doug said in a sympathetic tone, "This doesn't make great content for a newspaper interview, does it?" "No, I guess not." "Then may we continue this conversation off the record?" And I consented, but was definitely a bit disappointed that the monumental interview that I'd envisioned was obviously not going to materialize. Excellent. Come here. There's something that I'd like to show you. And Doug led me back to the rear of the library, to the PC workstation with the matrix of computer monitors. They were completely filled with spreadsheets, data, and statistics attached to the names of U.S. senators. He offered me the seat directly in front of the screens so that I could get a closer look. This research project would eventually be named Mapping Intent, a quantitative analysis of votes cast in the U.S. Senate between 2008 and 2020. And it was based on the belief that tracking the relationships between the voting records of senators and every imaginable quantifiable factor that could influence their votes would uncover insightful statistical details that could help to improve one's understanding. We'll speak more about mapping intent as the story progresses. Chapter 4: Finding Purpose. Despite it turning out far from my original intentions, I had a really good feeling after the meeting with Doug Wolf, and my mind was racing until I finally crashed from a severe lack of sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I found an email that read, "The following list comprises some of the sources that have been of value to me in forming my views on specific issues. In all cases, I feel like I have a strong working understanding of the contents therein." And attached to this was a bibliography of 273 books, papers, and articles. And looking back, this list from Doug is one of the greatest gifts anyone's ever given me, and I can't emphasize enough the impact that reading these works has had on my life. And for that matter, has had on the world in general as a result of their influence on his followers. I've reproduced this list for you and also included it in the end of the appendix book, along with some brief commentary on some of the contents. So for the next 2 days, I remained at home working on a 7-page editorial, which was an unabashed gushing over the significance of Doug's candidacy. And I brought this to the editor instead of the interview that I'd failed to procure. And he scoffed at the idea of publishing it in the Star Reporter, which I guess was logical, if only because it was at least 5 times the length of the whole editorial section. And I made a huge scene, suggesting that he should be ashamed to call himself a journalist and an editor if he wasn't open to recognizing news of great political significance. And then I quit and stormed out of the office. I bet the people who were working that day still talk about that now and again. It was quite a spectacle. The impulsiveness of the youthful mind. So I drove home, dejected and disappointed with the world. Later that evening, I reluctantly called Jamie's dad, figuring he'd be upset with my uninspired stint at the newspaper when it was almost certain that he'd pulled a few strings to make it possible. However, he had the exact opposite reaction and convinced me to look on the bright side. I may have lost a job, but at least I finally found something that I was passionate about. He suggested that I go back to see Doug, tell him what had transpired, and ask if I could be of use to him in any way. He also offered to lend me some money if I needed it to get me through the rest of the summer. Solid guy, that Marlon Craig, I'll tell you. So I took his advice and went back to Doug's house, and he greeted me warmly and invited me around to the back deck, where I told him about the editorial and the confrontation. I also offered to do whatever I could to help his candidacy, now that I was unemployed for the rest of the summer, and handed him a copy of the failed editorial for his review. And after skimming it over, he came back shaking his head with a feigned look of disbelief. "Well, I appreciate the kind and enthusiastic words, but I have a couple of questions for you. Shoot. Thinking as an impartial observer, if this is possible, would you have printed this if you were the editor of the Stowe Reporter? I'm not sure now that you mention it. And perhaps these conclusions you've reached are a bit premature, given your reservations from just a few days ago? Maybe more research and reflection is in order before taking such a strong stance? Maybe you're right. I'm glad you're open to this possibility. My suggestion is you go back home and think this over for a while. In the meantime, read some of the articles that I've cited, and if you still feel strongly in a week, come back and we'll talk again. When I returned, Doug appeared at the door and asked, "You've been reading?" "Yeah, almost non-stop for the last week." To which he answered simply, "Good. I'm glad you're back," and led me once again to the library. This time, however, there were visitors. I was introduced to Mr. James Lee and Mr. Lucien Garibaldi, who, as you know, both came to be included in the group referred to as the Seven. Now, you guys probably know James Lee as a programmer and technologist that funded some of the early initiatives that helped to kickstart the broader movement. But due to his low-key demeanor and behind-the-scenes approach to conducting his business, his contribution to the overall trajectory of what came to pass is highly underrated. And we'll talk more about James as the story progresses, although it's worth mentioning that by that time, he and Doug had been collaborating on the Mapping Intent project for years. As for Lucien, he was born just outside of Budapest, and from a young age shared James's passion for computers and programming. He also played a lot of basketball in his high school years, after an unusual growth spurt left him nearly 6'4" at age 13. And it was a basketball scholarship that eventually brought him to the George Washington University campus, just a short walk from the White House. Shortly after arrival, a colleague introduced Lucien to civic hacking, which was a technology-centric approach to solving issues affecting communities of people. Years later, he would become the visionary and founding member of James's first nonprofit undertaking. Lucien's idea was derived from the observation that unearthing useful data, often through cumbersome processes like a Freedom of Information Act filing, and then getting it into a clean and standardized state, was often the most time-consuming part of civic hacking studies involving government data. Of course, this was before many government organizations started proactively thinking about the data that they were capturing and the quality and formatting thereof. Lucien's pitch to James was simple. Wouldn't it make sense to have an organization that warehoused and indexed as much data relevant to civic hacking studies as possible? Adding links to works that used the data in question, along with alternate, modified versions of the original datasets that had been cleaned and standardized? And this was the basic origin story of hackerssharingdata.org. Although, obviously, this operation would expand its scope significantly in the years to come. The conversation that weekend started with Lucien reviewing Doug's methodology for gathering and indexing the data related to the Mapping Intent project. After that analysis was done and some minor recommendations for improvement were made, they changed the focus of the discussion to projects that Lucien was working on. The intensity ramped up a notch when Lucian casually mentioned some consulting work that he'd done for what came to be the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Act of 2018. And Doug was immediately able to recall significant details about that legislation. Soon, Lucian was on his feet and pacing, his lanky frame and large wingspan filling the library space as he gestured emphatically to emphasize certain points. I was struck by the contrast of Lucian's passionate energy and Doug's unwavering calmness, and was very impressed by how Doug maintained an equal position in the dialogue, despite doing comparatively little talking, like he'd carefully chosen his words for maximum effect and informational content. Later, Lucian and James revisited their ongoing discussion on a closely related topic: the relationship between data management and privacy. Although Doug wasn't an expert in this field, he knew enough to ask a few thoughtful, well-timed questions that helped them to reason to a higher collective understanding. They went like this non-stop for the whole afternoon and evening without any consideration for nourishment. Eventually, I ran out to get the guests a pizza and some sandwiches as they continued the discussion until late at night before turning in. Doug hardly ate, and when he did, his diet was usually confined to salads and lightly steamed vegetables. Doug's wife, Leslie, woke up on Sunday morning, saw the pizza box from the night before, and decided to prepare a lavish brunch for the guests, consisting of yogurt and granola, breads and spreads, fresh fruits, and a tofu scramble. Both of them feasted like they were making up for a lost day. I'd be remiss if I didn't say a few words about Leslie. She was a model of vibrancy and good health. In contrast to Doug, who was an introvert, Leslie was a well-known, popular figure around town. She led a parallel daytime life in the huge barn-like outbuilding that was built by the previous owners as a race car garage, and it had been repurposed to suit her needs. On the second floor, she had an art studio that served both as her own personal creation space and also as the location where she mentored a handful of young, promising artists from the area. And at ground level was a commercial kitchen where she worked with her business partner, Kathy Brown, to produce a dozen or so spreads that were based on recipes from all over the world. Lucian raved about their Ivar, a Balkan specialty made from eggplant and red peppers, and he used a baguette to clean the serving bowl until no trace remained. Leslie was an engaging speaker in small settings, and she would frequently give talks about art-related matters at local public libraries. Although she was extremely busy with her various undertakings, on those occasions when I was fortunate enough to spend time with her, she was a nurturing, mother-like character who always seemed to have a genuine interest in my well-being. Sunday's conversations were mostly centered around various books lying around the library. All three of them were particularly interested in the subject of propaganda, and I remember that they discussed the work of Peter Pomerantsev at length, especially the book titled "This Is Not Propaganda: Adventures in the War Against Reality," which described the execution of digital propaganda strategies developed primarily in Russian troll farms and how they came to affect the social fabrics and governments of a number of countries around the world. Later, James pointed out that the combination of propaganda and disinformation techniques found in Pomerantsev's books and the fractured informational ecostructure that evolved as a result of the internet were making it extremely difficult for the average voter to discern what was factually correct. By his logic, this environment almost necessitated the electing of politicians like Doug, who were extremely well informed and acting in the service of the electorate, as opposed to individual voters trying to navigate through the noise to arrive at well-founded conclusions of their own. The problem of understanding the contents of highly complex legislation was simply too difficult and time-consuming for the average voter to undertake successfully. It was easier and more effective to identify a person that you believed in and to outsource the policy decisions to them. And this led to a discussion of the merits of representative democracy versus direct democracy. After the propaganda discussion, Lucien excused himself briefly and went out to the meditation cabin to collect his things. When he returned to the library minutes later, he said, "Doug, maximum gratitude for inviting me into your house and being such a great host. It's a very special vibe that you've made here. Before I take off, I'd like to do an interview. There's been discussion of your mission on the internet. And I've thought a lot about the concept of selfless, informed representatives. And I hope that this visit would provide a unique opportunity to understand your perspective. But I've been so consumed by our discussions that I never got around to asking the questions that James and I assembled prior to our visit. Would you mind answering a few of them?" Doug consented, and after this interview was concluded, there was a ceremonious goodbye by Stagecoach Road standards, with Leslie even walking us out to the front door. After some hugs and profuse thanks showered on Leslie, we walked down the driveway to James's car. And when all three of us were inside, Lucien closed the passenger side door and remarked, "Wow! I guess you were right. That guy is the real deal. I have to admit, James, I did not understand your level of enthusiasm based only on that poster."
Yeah, that makes sense. I've worked with Doug for a few years now, so I had all of that experience to inspire my confidence.
Lucien then picked up the books sitting on the front seat between he and James. Tyson Yunkaporta's Sand Talk on Aborigine culture and indigenous perspective. Read the reviews on the back cover and said,
"Ah, this looks interesting."
Yeah, I read that on the plane. It was good. I especially liked the quote, "All law-breaking comes from that first evil thought, that original sin of placing yourself above the land or above other people."
James, do you know Sky Sandoval? He writes about similar stuff. His last book compares and contrasts the views of indigenous cultures that have been formed over thousands of years versus the 21st century culture that is rapidly changing. Anyway, he had an interesting perspective on Doug. Let me pull up the email. Here. In my experience, these are the primary characteristics of a true leader. One who sees themselves primarily as part of a capital S self, the whole community, as opposed to the lowercase s self, the individual embodiment. One who listens far more than they speak. One who is fluid in their convictions, constantly accepting and processing worthwhile feedback. Willing to admit being wrong. Willing to change their mind. One who seeks the company of those who are similarly wise and well-intentioned. One to whom popularity is not of primary importance. Now contrast that against the typical politician in Washington who spends an inordinate amount of time and effort convincing others of the superiority of their positions on a wide range of issues, often has rigid convictions, and would be more likely to double down than to admit mistakes and take immediate action to correct them, feels an extremely strong identification with and belief in the small s embodied self, and often whose primary goal is to be personally popular.
By this time, I was starting to feel more comfortable around these guys, and so I chimed in, "Wow, well said. So, Lucian, this is your first time meeting Doug? What about him made the biggest impression on you?"
Do you play basketball, Alan?
Well, tennis has always been my sport, but sure, I play pickup hoops every now and then.
Okay, I'm going to share the story of our George Washington team my junior year. Our captain was a fifth-year senior point guard from Baltimore named Landon Phillips. And Landon was a solid all-around player. Excellent floor leader, distributor of the ball, scorer, defender, all things. He wasn't tall enough or athletic enough to be drafted by the NBA, but by that time he'd become one of the best players in our league. We were picked to finish at the bottom of the standings of the Atlantic 10, and there was some off-season talk that he'd leave as a graduate transfer to a more competitive team for his last year, but he chose to stick around and to get his MBA and to lead our team. Landon was very focused when he came to the gym, and with his strong effort and very intense personality, the tone for our team was very clearly established. The day before our first practice, we had a players-only meeting, and Landon proposed 3 simple rules to guide our season. And then he went around the circle, one player at a time, and confirmed that everyone was committed to upholding these rules. They were: we agreed to be on time for every commitment. We agreed to give 100% of our focus and effort when we were together. We agreed to put the team first in all cases. And that's it. With him setting such a strong example, there was no option but to show up on time and to give your best. Now, if someone did not hold themselves to these high standards, he would let them know about it. And trust me, you did not want to be that guy. But most of the time, he was very supportive and encouraging. Despite being our top scorer, he was extremely unselfish with the ball and quick to defer credit to the rest of the team. Now, that team far exceeded the modest expectations of our fans and the media, and we finished in second place in the Atlantic 10, and even won a play-in NCAA tournament game. And since James can never get enough of hearing that story, in that win, I made 8 threes. This performance was an extreme outlier, as I was only a fringe contributor, usually the 8th or 9th player into the game. And my job was basically to give maximum effort on defense and to make the open shots when they came. Coach would send me in to guard the hot scorer or shooter that he wanted to bother. And I'd hustle and scrap and kick and bang and grab and do anything that I could do to disrupt him. Usually I would get a few fouls too. Any scoring by me was bonus. Landon spent a lot of time mentoring the bench guys. His message to everyone was, think of all the times that you have seen an unlikely star emerge in the deciding moments of a big game. So be ready when it's your time. Over the season, I gained more confidence and began to approach every situation more prepared. When the ball swung my way, I was ready to strike. So, in that win against Cal, I entered the game in my job of agitator and got a couple nice looks at threes and made them both before going back to the bench. Then in the second half, I came back in, and right away we had miscue and there was a scrum for the ball. And as the shot clock ran to 0 and before the buzzer, I picked up the ball and shot a difficult step back 3. Swish. With the crowd growing crazy, Landon came over towards me, close enough that I could read his lips, and nodded his head while mouthing, "Shoot it." And on that same defensive possession, he perfectly timed the pass going to the wing and stepped into the passing lane and stole the ball. And dribbled down the court in 2-on-1 fast break, but he didn't go to the basket. He pulled up in the key and he threw me a diagonal cross-court pass as I approached the three-point line as a trailer. I have no idea how he knew that I would be there. But nothing but the bottom of the net. So now I was in the zone, and everybody in the whole gym knew it. On a sideline out of bounds, after television timeout, coach drew up a play where I came off some screens and shook free from the defender. And the ball was lofted across the court, and I caught it over my shoulder like a football wide receiver, and then turned towards the basket. And the defender sees me at the three-point line, and panics and streaks towards me. And I give him a ball and head fake, and whoosh! He goes by me, and I take a few dribbles, and big dunk. For 15 minutes, everything was possible. With 4 minutes left, I was totally drained of energy and came out of the game, but we had double-digit lead by then, and it was not close in the end. In that game, I made 8 threes and scored 29 points, my career high, with 23 points in the second half. Now, everything about that night, an excellent team performance leading to a memorable win against a superior opponent, and my own personal highlight moment, all of this was made possible by the environment that we experienced every day with Landon. He made me believe in us, and he made me believe in myself. And despite being our best player, his leadership was an even bigger factor in our success. He brought out the best in us. So why am I telling you all this? Because this is similar to how I feel about Doug. He's well-read and very smart, obviously. But what impressed me most were the captivating conversations that he seemed to curate without ever taking a dominant position. Those discussions, in my presence, that is what the conversation has to look like. Synergistic interactions among well-informed and good-intentioned people. And Doug is the only man that I've ever met that has both intellectual grounding and the moral authority to preside over a conversation of the brightest minds.
The normally reserved James may have leapt out of his seat had he not been constrained by his seatbelt.
Yes! Yes! Spot on, sir.
Okay, so I get it now. What's next?
I'm not sure, Lucien. I guess the obvious thing is to help Doug get elected?
Well, that's easier said than done, James. Not discussing the issues and shutting out the media does not seem like a way to win an election.
Yeah, I feel ya. I guess we just have to assume that Doug knows what's best under these unusual circumstances that he's created.
Okay, I'll think about what I can do to contribute. This should be interesting at the very least.
After 10 minutes or so of silence, where Lucien looked like he was deep in thought, he continued.
So, thinking out loud, one obstacle that we are facing is establishing Doug's aptitude, given his unwillingness to talk about issues or to speak to the press. I think Alan mentioned yesterday that this was his big question too. The second challenge is trying to support Doug's claim of selflessness. Given the current state of cynicism regarding politics and politicians, this is not going to be readily accepted by everyone. We saw some of that pushback in the Reddit threads. So here is an idea. Since I recorded the interview with Doug on my phone, why don't I transcribe that and post some of his answers? Since we weren't speaking about Vermont-related matters, I don't think that this violates his intention of not wanting to run based on specific issues. What it might do, though, is to lend insight into his thought processes. What do you think?
Don't you feel like that's a violation of his privacy and trust?
Of course, we'd run it by him first. Why don't I write up something in the next 24 hours and you can discuss it with Doug before you go back to California?
Well, I'm not sure he'll go for it, but it's worth a shot.
Okay, sounds good.
The conversation was still active when we arrived at the airport, and so we parked the car and accompanied Lucien into the terminal until he had to hustle through security to catch his flight back to DC. The more they talked, the more I realized that James had been a primary factor in the application of the original bulletin board discussion. From what I can gather, he wrote a strongly worded email to his extended network in support of Doug, made a lot of personal phone calls, and encouraged others to share on social media and participate in the discussion. By then, he'd amassed a fair amount of personal credibility between his philanthropy and professional network, and the momentum of the discussion benefited from the multiplier effect of friends and associates telling their friends and associates, and most of this within a window of just a few days. James and I were silent for most of the car ride back to Morrisville. There was a lot to think about. At some point I said, "James, I just want you to know that I'm also all in on Doug. I believe in him like you guys believe in him. I'm not sure how much I can help, but I'll definitely do what I can."
Noted. That's good to know. I saw you were reading a stack of papers this weekend. That was Mapping Intent?
Yes.
Well, what are your impressions?
I've just started to scratch the surface, but it's definitely an interesting topic, and I'll be curious to see the conclusions that you draw from the data.
Okay then, I've got a proposal for you. Since Doug wants to start focusing on matters related to Vermont, we could really use someone to help get everything arranged and formatted and to write some commentary with his guidance. While I could oversee this work, we'd need someone who's comfortable working independently because I don't have time to micromanage. I'd pay you well, and it would certainly be good experience if you're into this sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested. I'm presently without a job.
Okay then. Why don't we get started on this and circle back in a month or so to make sure that everything's working out? If so, you have a job until the project's finished.
And that's how I came to be involved in Mapping Intent. The amount of information that James and Doug had assembled was almost overwhelming, and the scope of it was many times greater than anything that I'd worked on previously. It was quite an undertaking. To make matters more challenging, James also convinced me to take a fall semester Introduction to Computer Science class that demanded a highly disproportionate amount of my class time as well. As a result, I worked tirelessly from the moment that I returned for senior year until the month after graduation when Mapping Intent was finally published. But this new sense of purpose made me feel alive, and I didn't really resent the fact that I no longer had much time for my friends. And while I originally felt guilty about my decision to forego writing a senior honors thesis, the work that I did in its stead ended up being far more interesting and rewarding. The afternoon after the ride to the airport, I returned to Stagecoach Road on James's suggestion so that we could finalize the details of the collaboration and run them by Doug. When I entered the library, the two of them were engaged in what seemed like a civil discussion. But despite the calm appearance, closer inspection revealed that the debate was contentious. And James was starting to show subtle signs of frustration as he presented his point of view.
Doug, I'm assuming that by hanging the poster, you're implying that your goal, or at least one of your goals, is to win the election and to perform the proposed service in the Vermont State Legislature? Am I correct? Well, in order for this to take place, some effort needs to be applied. I don't think this is magically going to happen by itself. This quote that Lucian sent over has almost nothing to do with policy that you'll encounter at the state level. While I fully appreciate and support the concept of not running based on issues, offering an answer to a thoughtful question that lends insight into your manner of thinking could be very useful in helping voters to understand you. To be honest, even though you've had this fortuitous occurrence of your candidacy and purpose for running widely discussed on the internet, I suspect that you're still well short of having enough votes to actually win the election.
I interrupted here. Doug, I have to agree with James. This is obviously the way that I felt in that very first discussion with you. I love the idea of a selfless candidate pursuing political office without running on a platform, but rather on integrity and knowledge. But somehow we're going to have to convince enough people that you specifically are one that's worthy of their support. The bibliography is a great start towards describing your knowledge base, and I'm obviously very thankful for that because I've learned an awful lot in the last couple weeks. But for others who haven't met you, I feel like this isn't enough. We need to somehow convince people to see you as we see you. Now, James and Lucian are on your side. They understand what you're trying to accomplish, and they're not going to ask you to do something that falls outside of the bounds of your principles. Because your principles are the primary reason that we're all so excited about your mission. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but I felt like I had to say this because I really want to see you get elected. And given the limitations that you're putting on what can be done, I think you need to take advantage of every well-intended effort of support that falls within these bounds. A long silence followed my words. Minutes that seemed like hours. While I was talking, I was focused on my words and not really reading the room. But now I was starting to feel doubt and definitely wished that I'd kept my thoughts to myself. I welcomed any response, no matter how critical, but this extended silence was almost too much to bear. After the long delay, Doug said, "I understand your logic and I believe in your intentions. You have my blessings to publish this answer if you think it's best. Thank you both for your consideration and well-reasoned arguments." And James immediately left the room and called Lucian, who posted this the next day, Tuesday, August 23rd. I just returned from a visit with the bulletin board guy, Doug Wolf, in Vermont, and I was impressed beyond my wildest expectations. His self-awareness, intelligence, and scope of knowledge are all off the charts. I'm firmly committed to doing anything that I can do to help this man get elected. We desperately need more leaders like him in today's world. While Doug is adamant that he's not willing to discuss specific issues prior to the election, he was willing to answer some questions that helped me gain insight into the potential importance of his selfless approach. He gave one very long answer for him to the following question, and I thought it was worth sharing.
Of the discussion threads that have developed in the wake of the bulletin board post, one of the biggest themes has been that we are living in a time where individualism and the pursuit of self-interest is the dominant social trend. Now, this seems very different from your offer of public service to political office and the implied emphasis on your selfless contribution to society. Outside of the realm of elected officials, can you identify another area where you feel that our emphasis on the individual is resulting in negative societal consequences?
Risk management. More specifically, the management of tail risk, or prevention or mitigation of statistically improbable events.
Interesting. Would you care to elaborate on that?
If an individual prioritizing self-interest is put in charge of managing tail risk, then we can expect that individual to act in concert with his nature when faced with a crisis. Unfortunately, this often leads to a reaction of close your eyes and pray that the situation improves when a potential outlier case arises, instead of proactively mitigating the worst-case scenarios with an associated cost. Clearly, the opposite behavior from what the job description requires. We've seen this time and time again in the world of finance, where the responsible party is unwilling to pay the price to set things straight, and instead sweeps potential danger under the rug and hopes for the best. But disguising mismanagement until it's too late compounds the errors to the extent that they bankrupt large funds, or in some cases even massive global financial institutions. The applicable proverb here would be, a stitch in time saves 9. But the gravest threat of negative societal consequences from self-interested behavior in risk management happens on the national and global level. For instance, the policies and actions of the 3 largest military states suggest that their primary goal is to maximize the interests of the individual country, first and foremost. Of course, one can argue that this mentality has been present for the entirety of documented human history, where national and tribal conflict have been ever present. But we've entered an age where we no longer have the luxury to indulge the false sense of country to the detriment of the human race. The emergence of numerous man-made threats for global catastrophe over the past century have necessitated that we change our ways. We have shown in the issues of environmental degradation and climate change that anything less than a globally unified effort is unlikely to produce the types of changes necessary to limit the damage before we suffer irreparable consequences and then react too late. When we were talking about Nick Bostrom's book earlier, James noted that the absence of an international policy governing the responsible development of AI means that it will continue to be weaponized, and this could have very grave consequences in the near future as this technology evolves rapidly. Proper risk management can only be undertaken by a person or entity that values the interest of the group or community over the interest of the individual. The absence of that, in today's complex world with a growing number of global catastrophic threats, is arguably a problem that humanity must overcome in the near future in order to survive.
Once again, there was an unusually large amount of activity surrounding Lucien's post, and it's hard to describe the impact that this conversation had on the psyche of those who were actively engaged. You really have to grok the context to fully understand. Many of us had been desperately craving the opportunity to participate in thoughtful and constructive discussions regarding our futures. And Doug's declaration and candidacy became the primary catalyst that jump-started our enthusiasm and interest.
Chapter 5. Take to the Streets.
For most of September and into October, there was very little activity on the campaign front. After considerable lobbying, Doug allowed James and I to purchase a web address and put up a one-page website that reiterated what Doug had written to me in his email. The following list is a compilation of some of the sources that have been of value to me in forming my views. In all cases, I feel like I have a strong working understanding of the contents therein. And listed below was the bibliography of 273 entries. He also allowed me to make a second, smaller laminate that read simply, "Please visit www.dougwolf2022.com." And I hung it directly beside his original, which was still there on the same bulletin board downtown. Other than that, not only was Doug doing absolutely zero campaigning himself, but he was also nearly impossible to reach. He corresponded regularly with only a handful of people, and if you weren't one of them, it was very difficult to engage him. The best chance was to find your way through to him via someone who was already in touch. One person who was able to navigate the process was Istvan Laszlo, one of the leaders of the Hacker Lab, which was a shared tech space in Burlington. After a couple of unsuccessful attempts to reach Doug by mail, he reached out to his old friend Lucien to intervene on his behalf. The folks at the lab were generally a politically active group, and they'd been watching the evolution of the Doug Wolf story from day one. When Lucien made his blog post after returning from his visit with Doug, they became determined to meet him. The hackers had already been exploring the subject of individualism and its potential perils in their Book of the Month series, and through Lucien, they reached out to Doug to propose a group discussion. He accepted, and a meeting was scheduled for Saturday, October 8th, which coincided with the visit that I was making to consult with Doug on the Mapping Intent project. When I arrived at Doug's place on Friday night the 7th, there was no sign of an election campaign anywhere, except for numerous stacks of printed information related to the bills of the last few sessions of the Vermont legislature. We spoke briefly about the Mapping Intent project and how it was progressing, but Doug was mostly interested in my studies at school. We talked about all 4 of my classes, but especially about the ethical reasoning class I was taking, and we discussed the works of Aristotle and Kant at length. On Saturday morning, I found Leslie in the backyard with Sonia Tuckerman, preparing the garden for the winter ahead. Sonia was also visiting from out of town and staying in the meditation cabin. Immediately, I could tell by the way that Leslie and Doug interacted with Sonia that there was something special about her, like she was one of them. In the early afternoon, the folks from the Hacker Lab picked up Lucien at the airport and brought him along to the meeting at Doug's place. Lucien had previously directed them to the webpage with Doug's bibliography and suggested some guidelines to follow in order to make the most of their meeting. Questions regarding opinions on specific Vermont-related issues were discouraged for obvious reasons, but the introduction of common threads of interest from Doug's bibliography was highly encouraged. In the end, it went pretty well. They started by discussing some of the items on Doug's list, but the conversation soon branched off to include recent hacker Book of the Month selections. The part I remember most vividly was related to a book called Life the Movie: How Entertainment Conquered Reality. Of special interest to the hackers was the author's suggestion that the primary qualification for a U.S. president was to be a media star, a celebrity of sorts. Obviously, this was in direct contrast to Doug's mission and the way he was handling things. Although Life the Movie wasn't on Doug's 273-item bibliography, unbeknownst to the hackers, the physical book was actually resting on a high shelf in the corner near the door. And at some point, Doug got up from the table and retrieved the hard copy, thumbed through some Post-its, and then read them an excerpt from the book about Trump the businessman, published in 1999, mind you. 17 years before he was elected president. That section ends. What really made Trump a symbol of the 1980s was less his showy greed than his willing compliance with the secondary effect of the media. Namely, that in order to compete with entertainment, one had to turn oneself into entertainment. After a couple of hours with Doug, the hackers all had that same wide-eyed look that I'd previously seen in Lucien after his August visit. Doug had proven to be as advertised, and his calm and focused presence also made a big impression, as usual. So, when their time is up, Istvan proclaimed his unconditional support and asked, "So what can we do for you?" And after letting the question hang for a while, like Doug was prone to do, he answered, "Act according to the maxim that you would wish all other rational people to follow, as if it were universal law." This was, I think, a clever inside joke directed at me. The Kantian categorical imperative from our discussion the night before. He offered it with deadpan seriousness, and I found this to be very amusing, but suppressed a smile. The question was, of course, ridiculous to him. He didn't want anything from them, or anybody really. And it took them a while to realize this. And when they finally excused themselves, feeling slightly confused, Lucien and I followed them out to the car, and we all agreed to continue the discussion at my former coffee spot at the northern edge of downtown Stowe. After everyone had ordered and gotten themselves situated, we resumed with a previously unvoiced, lingering question when one of the hackers came right out and asked directly, "What's the deal with this 'on this day I am born again' line from the bulletin board post? Why include that? Is that some sort of religious statement?" And Lucien answered that he couldn't speak for Doug, but he had a strong opinion on why this line was ingenious and an important precedent. He said,
"People are flawed. We make mistakes, and we say things that we wish we had not said. Right? In this age that Zuboff called surveillance capitalism, many of these transgressions have been captured or documented in some way. Consider Snowden's revelations about the NSA, and that was 9 years ago. Long time given the pace of evolution in technology. Consider the power that those who control this data could have over someone seeking public office. The hard evidence of their regrettable thoughts, words, and actions. Even those with perfect conduct could be compromised by words taken out of context. It seems self-evident that all of this is a massive threat to the integrity of future government. I consider Doug's line to be an ingenious counter to this alarming data trend. A line in the sand. Yes, I may have made mistakes in the past, but from this point forward, I am holding myself to a higher standard.
Once it was reestablished that everyone present was in full support of Doug's candidacy, Lucien unveiled a plan that he'd been considering since the hackers first reached out to him. He wanted to, in his words, take to the streets, which conjures up a different image than what happened in reality. First of all, 3 of the 4 towns in Doug's legislative district had a population of roughly 1,000. And none of those had a busy downtown that attracted a lot of people. Morrisville had a population of closer to 5,000, and a downtown with occasional foot traffic at least. So when we took to the streets the next day, Sunday the 9th, 5 of us went to Morrisville and established ourselves near Doug's bulletin board post and within a stone's throw of the main downtown intersection. And the remaining carload of 4 traveled around the other 3 towns and hit up various general stores and other potential gathering places over the course of the day. We were all outfitted in black hoodies donated by James that looked more like band merch than something one would associate with a political campaign. The white lettering on the front read simply, DougWolf2022.com. It was an interesting scene in Morrisville due to the unusual appearance of our group in the typically tranquil downtown area. For the first hour or so, most people went out of their way to keep their distance from us. While there had been extensive internet chatter and the simple website, this was the first physical manifestation of anything related to Doug Wolf besides the bulletin board post. After a while, it was generally understood that we were harmless and easy to talk to, and I was encouraged by how many folks came by to chat and seemed genuinely interested in talking about Doug's campaign. Of course, our visit had been preceded by many discussions in town trying to make sense of the strange poster and the subsequent internet phenomenon. But at the same time, I grew a bit concerned by the sudden realization that Doug was running for office in a small town environment where hardly anybody knew him. I'd characterize Morrisville in 2022 as a frontier town of sorts, where young couples and professionals were flocking to in order to buy an affordable home and participate in what seemed to be a renewal of sorts. Throughout the prior decade, old buildings were being renovated and dynamic new businesses were starting to transform the town. On the whole, younger folks and those new to town were the ones most open to Doug's candidacy. They came in with fewer pre-existing views and were more likely to have been engaged in the internet conversation surrounding Doug. But on that Sunday in Morrisville, the discussion downtown included young and old, new arrivals, and those whose families had lived in the area for generations. Almost everyone wanted some personal information regarding Doug. Who was he? What was he like? Some had indirect connections, like a friend of a friend worked with him on the Hunger Mountain Co-op expansion project, or more frequently, is that Leslie's husband? But most had absolutely no idea who he was. Lucien was in his element in this environment and spent the whole day energetically engaging anyone who wanted to talk about Doug. His pitch was basically, this is a very smart guy who knows an awful lot about governance, and I wholeheartedly believe in his integrity and the importance of his mission.
and he'd often point to the bulletin board for emphasis. And the rest of us pretty much followed suit and expressed the same sentiment in our conversations about Doug. Sunday afternoon provided some internet content for those who were anxiously awaiting the latest chapter of the story. A professional photographer traveling on a tour bus through the heart of Vermont during foliage season got out when they were refueling on the next block and filmed Lucien holding court for interested onlookers and in direct view of the original bulletin board post, with his overflowing energy and gesturing. And this video clip was also widely circulated. It may have been a coincidence, but I suspect that it was curiosity that brought Sonia and Leslie downtown on that Sunday afternoon for a cup of tea. They sat in the cafe by the window for an hour or so, our discussions in partial view, and then Leslie returned home to work, while Sonia stayed behind and casually conversed with us and observed our conversations with others. Sonia was off on a walkabout town when the traveling carload returned from their rounds. Shortly thereafter, most of the hackers called it a day and headed back to Burlington, while Istvan's friend Shahira stayed behind with me and joined me on a bench. She was telling me about the recent completion of her latest urban art project when Sonia returned with a to-go container filled with rice and vegetables and offered some to Shahira and I, who were both famished from a long day of work. The food was delicious. We devoured the remainder almost instantly and then persuaded Sonia to lead us back to the source so that we could buy more. Around the corner and down a long block, we found an older Nepalese gentleman with bright eyes and a welcoming smile, preparing magical food out of the back of a gas station. There were curries and dumplings, rice and noodles, vegetables and delicious dipping sauces. And Shahira assessed this almost surreal scene and whispered to me, "Is everybody around here like this?" After all, what were the odds of finding Doug, Leslie, Sonia, and then this guy in the same small town in one weekend? Since the food was fairly priced, we emptied our pockets and bought enough of everything for everyone in our party, including Lucien and Istvan, who'd remained behind in an ongoing huddle-like discussion with several townspeople. While the food was being prepared for us to take away, I followed an impulsive idea and hustled out the door, holding up one finger to signal that I'd be right back. I jogged the block or so to Moog's place and spotted a familiar bartender immediately, and when I got his attention, I raised my voice to cut through the ambient noise in the bar. "Doug Wolf from the Bulletin Board Post is the sax guy." And it took him a few seconds to connect the words, and then he repeated the idea back in the form of a question. "The Bulletin Board guy is the sax guy?" "Yes." And with my business efficiently concluded, I jogged back to rejoin Sonia and Shahira. Our associates were as hungry as we were, and when we returned, the five of us feasted silently before we climbed into Istvan's EV and headed back to Stagecoach Road. After closing the door, Istvan pivoted his head and asked Shahira, "So how did it go?" And she answered, "Pretty good, I guess. Man, this is my new definition of the middle of nowhere. It was hard to find anyone to talk to, though we did eventually meet some friendly people and have some good conversations. I felt like almost everyone that we spoke to was receptive to what we were trying to communicate, but there was one question that came up several times that none of us had a good answer for." "Oh yeah, and what would that be?" "Lucien, you said yesterday that a Vermont rep earns something like $750 a week, and that's just for the months when the legislature is operating?" And since no one's in it for the money, it makes sense that there's no fierce campaigning going on here, mostly just yard signs and word of mouth. And while we're at a disadvantage with Doug being silent, you feel this is something that we can overcome with effort?
That's right.
All right. So if nobody's in it for the money, can't you say a lot of the Vermont reps are making a financial sacrifice and performing a service to the community? So the question is, what's different about Doug?
Shahira, that is the same question that I asked James when he called me for the first time speaking the virtues of Doug. Yes, he sounds like an interesting guy, but what's the difference between him and the typical good guy citizen that you described? Why all this interest, especially in a small election? And then when it was me speaking Doug's praises on my blog, James flipped the question back to me. Like you and James, I don't have a convincing answer for those who doubt Doug.
Meanwhile, while looking over towards Shahir and Lucian, I noticed Sonia sitting back following the conversation with her eyes. She had the look of someone who knew something that we didn't. Of course, this made sense given that she'd spent more time around Doug than all of us combined. Sonia, you know Doug better than any of us. How would you answer this question?
You'd like me to answer for those who are present here?
Yes, if you're willing.
Well, my personal experience suggests that when I see Leslie and others like her applying positive energy and focused effort towards nurturing their gardens, chances are that this will result in an abundant harvest. The more effort, the better. Hearing your conversations of earlier, it seems that you all believe that good energy combined with intelligent, focused effort by Doug in his scholarship will result in excellent performance in his legislative duties if he's elected. Now, to your question, 20 years ago, Doug and Leslie learned that she couldn't bear children, and it triggered a crisis in both of them. Doug became a seeker of answers and explored many of the world's religious and spiritual traditions. He gradually zeroed in on a system of inquiry closely aligned with the 20th century Vipassana meditation movement in Burma. The contents of the Satipatthana Sutta, one of the most revered discourses given by the Buddha, was a frequent focus of his meditations. I met Doug at a meditation retreat in Massachusetts shortly after I left my pastorship in 2012. He's meditated every morning since. A few months before the COVID pandemic started, he attended a month-long retreat in Myanmar, the country formerly known as Burma. And when he returned, he wound down his consulting practice and ramped up his meditation practice. For more than 2 years, he lived in almost complete silence, from which he emerged with the Bulletin Board Declaration of Selflessness. Like many before who've gone to the desert or to the forest, to a cave or to the mountaintop, he emerged from this extensive focused effort as a man transformed. I'm not personally aware of another case where such a person returned to society willing to offer their service through politics. Somehow, this gesture has awakened something in you and others like you. And this, my friends, is how Doug Wolf differs from others.
As Sonia was ending her explanation, we pulled into the driveway on Stagecoach Road. And when Istvan turned off the engine, we all just sat there in the darkness and reflected on what we just heard. I broke the silence by saying quietly, "Sonia, you're not going to believe this, but when I first arrived here at the end of last spring, just a couple of months before the bulletin board post, Doug showed up at Moog's place downtown here and sat in on sax with my friend Jamie's band. And he just crushed it. I don't even have the words to describe that performance. Then, as quickly as he'd materialized, he disappeared into the night, and I didn't see him again until I knocked on his door that first time." And Sonia smiled her heart-melting smile, like every fiber of her being was smiling.
You know, I would believe it, because I suspect that I was here in Morrisville on that very evening. Leslie and I were experimenting with a new rhubarb recipe in the kitchen, and we were a bit shocked when we heard Doug warming up in the library, because he rarely spoke in those days, and he hadn't played sax, as far as Leslie knew, since he began the period of silence. For a few minutes, he blew these incredible, almost divine sounds out of his saxophone. Like you, I have no words. And then he drove off in the Subaru. He must have been headed your way.
I asked Sonia, "Wow, what do you think that was?"
I don't know, maybe 2 years of human expression, filed away in the deepest recesses of his soul, that bubbled over and found its way into the world through his horn?
For me, that sounded like a fitting description. And you know what? I think that night at Moog's place with RTP might have been the last time that Doug Wolf ever played the sax. Man, I feel so blessed to have been a witness to that. The next day, Lucien and I returned home, but the hackers took responsibility for the local canvassing effort and actively recruited friends and other like-minded folks to join them. First, they made lists of anybody that they knew who lived in Doug's district and contacted them directly, encouraging those that shared their enthusiasm to make their own lists and then do the same. Secondly, they increased participation in the Sunday visits to Doug's district. 3 weeks later, over 50 volunteers had earned their own black hoodies. My primary contribution to the effort was a testimonial in support of Doug, more succinct than the failed editorial for the Stowe Reporter, and I found a way to get it included in every Front Porch Forum in Doug's district. Front Porch Forum was a group of email-based newsletters organized by town. And it was an important network of distribution because it generally had an extremely high participation rate among residents of those towns. Thus, it was a good way to reach a significant number of voters in the district. So, published among the recommendations for plumbers, advertisements for yard sales, and descriptions of lost pets, was my heartfelt appeal on behalf of Doug. It read, "Voters of the Lamoille, Washington Representative District. I've had the pleasure of spending a considerable amount of time around Doug Wolf, independent candidate for the Vermont legislature, over the past several months. In brief, here's my opinion of his candidacy. I've never met anyone quite like him. His scope and depth of knowledge on matters related to American government and the level of respect and confidence he inspires from the highly intelligent people in his network is beyond anything that I've ever witnessed. And yet, it's his commitment to selflessly and tirelessly serving the constituents of this district that's probably his primary qualification. I believe in this man and his mission more than I've believed in anyone or anything else in my life. Therefore, I offer my strongest personal endorsement of Doug Wolf and encourage you to review the bibliography at www.dougwolf2022.com and make your own informed decision on Tuesday, November 8th. Alan Terry, student of government, Harvard University. 2 days before the election, Doug called and suggested that he didn't support the practice of trying to persuade voters at polling locations. And so I told the hackers who had planned on doing just that, and they canceled this operation. On Election Day itself, there was a surprising number of media people gathered in Morrisville, but in Doug's case, there was no story to be found. With no campaign presence anywhere, there was nothing to film and nobody to talk to. Determined not to be denied a second time, they turned the lack of a story into the story itself. The most popular video on the subject was a segment by CNN entitled, "The Election Where Nothing Happened," with a reporter standing outside the polling location at the Morrisville Municipal Building and showing what nothing looked like. Although visiting with Doug during election night was out of the question, I felt like I had to share the experience with someone, and so I took the bus to Burlington and spent the evening with the hackers at the Hacker Lab. By 11 o'clock p.m. local time, it seemed fairly certain from the results of the reporting polling locations that Doug had been elected. Around midnight, we all smiled and cheered when someone put the CNN story on an oversized monitor on the wall. And then Istvan cued the song which would forever be the anthem of the movement for those who were present that night. By the end, everyone was belting out the chorus with David Byrne. Heaven, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. There were tears of joy in almost every pair of eyes. Something had happened. A miracle of sorts even. A moment that none of us would ever forget and that would change us all forever. The next morning, the television crews went home, and it was business as usual in Morrisville. Now, it was time to get to work. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, since it's getting late, I guess that's all for tonight's presentation. Feel free to join me here tomorrow evening for dinner and the next installment of our story.
Please feel free to visit the official Bulletin Boarders website to join the mailing list and be alerted about the release of the remaining episodes at www.storytellingtheater.com. Bulletin Boarders was written, performed, recorded, and produced by Daniel Waterhouse, with guest performances by Derek Peterson and Megan Burns of the Academy of Service. The song Point of View was written by Bonnie Payne and Daniel Rodriguez and performed by It's Evolving.